My name is Martin, and this evening I have got a bedtime story for you. It's called Edward and Henry Take the Train. Now, this is Henry here. He's a teddy bear, as you can see, but as you will find out, he's so much more than just any old teddy bear. So, let us snuggle down, get nice and comfortable, and get ready for your bedtime story. Henry is a teddy bear, but by no means is he an ordinary teddy bear. Though he's too shy to talk out loud, he loves going on adventures with his best friend, Edward. Edward is 11 3/4. He's tall for his age. He has brown hair that his mum, Mrs. Green, insists has to be combed every day. Sometimes twice if he's been playing in the garden. Edward doesn't have many friends. Well, he does, but unfortunately they've all had to go away. You see, the year is 1941. Almost 2 years ago, a lot of powerful people in the world became very cross with each other. Mr. Chamberlain, who was a very boring man in a very boring suit, said that all the children needed to go and live in the countryside because that would be safe. So they did, but not our Edward. He had to remain in London with his family to help them run, with Mr. Green, his father, of course, being head of their shop. Their shop sold vegetables. Henry the teddy bear had noticed that recently Edward had been feeling a bit sad. Edward said that he missed his friends, and that the only thing that was keeping him going was knowing that his best friend, Henry, would always be with him. Early one morning, Mrs. Green brought Edward breakfast in bed, which was strange because it wasn't Edward's birthday. Mrs. Green said that Edward and Henry were going to have to go on a special holiday to his grandparents' house in Winchester. "Oh, but that's not fair," said Edward. "I want to stay in London with you and Daddy." Mrs. Green wiped a tear from her eye with the corner of her apron. She gave Edward a big hug and a kiss on the forehead. She then went downstairs and began tidying the house. "I don't want to leave London either," thought Henry. "It's such a lovely place, full of red buses and pigeons. They don't have those down in Winchester." Edward gave a loud sniff as he wiped his nose on his pyjama sleeve, then picked up his final piece of toast and dunked it in his boiled egg. "Oh, Henry, what are we going to do? Why can't everybody just get along? Then we wouldn't have to leave home." Henry agreed and wished the same. But alas, lately, wishes hadn't done very much. Edward got up and put on the clothes that Mrs. Green had lovingly laid out for him. He went to his large wooden wardrobe and took out his small suitcase. He placed it on the bed and slowly began packing his things into it. This made Henry think, if I had a suitcase, what would I pack in it? I don't have much, but I suppose the first thing would have to be the box on a string that Mrs. Green made for me. You see, it matches the one that Edward has, and we have to carry them everywhere. And you might just be able to see the little box here, because back in this time it contained a very important piece of equipment, a gas mask, and everybody, as Henry rightly said, had to carry them around with them. Then I think I would take the family photograph from the bedside table of all four of us. And then I'd pack the biggest bag of rhubarb and custard boiled sweets that I could buy. But unfortunately, Henry didn't have a suitcase, nor did he have any money to buy sweets with. But what he did have was his best friend, and that meant more than anything else in the world. Once he had finished packing his suitcase, Edward closed the suitcase and locked it with 2 loud clicks. It was so heavy he struggled to lift it up and needed both hands to carry it down the stairs. Once he had dumped it in the hallway, he shot back up the stairs like a flash to return to Henry. "You didn't think I'd forget you, did you?" asked Edward. "Not for a second," thought Henry. They both sat on the bed and Edward read aloud his latest copy of the Beano. With what felt like only a few minutes later, the large clock in Mr. Green's study rang to say that it was 2:30. Mrs. Green shouted from up the stairs, "Eddie, darling, it's time to go now." There was a slight shake in her voice, and there was a heavy feeling in Edward's heart. Come on, Henry, don't be like that. Why not think of it as a holiday?" said Edward, reassuring Henry that everything would be quite all right. After a short and silent bus ride to Waterloo Station, Edward found himself feeling quite upset. He held onto Mrs. Green's hand with a firm grip, one that he wished would never be broken. But unfortunately, they got to platform 3. The station clock showed that it was almost 3 o'clock, and that there was only a few minutes before they had to depart. Nobody can ever imagine how difficult it is to say goodbye to somebody that you love, unless they have been through the horrid task of doing it before. Mrs. Green was one of those people. She had said goodbye to her mother only a few years ago. It was at this moment that she felt the same pain in her heart and the sick feeling in her stomach as she stood on the platform, looking in to the 3rd-class compartment where the boys now sat. She had given them both a parting gift, a small little brown tag with their names on it, and then the name and address of their grandparents in Winchester. The train let off a screech from its high-pitched whistle, with a large puff of black smoke and a sharp jerk forward. The mucky green steam train burst into life with a groan. "I love you, Mummy," shouted Edward, with tears rolling down his face. He banged on the window, shouting at the top of his lungs. The train soon went from a slow, sluggish speed to a steady chug. The steam filled the platform as Mrs. Green disappeared into the mist. Edward turned from the window and noticed that they were not alone. You see, sat in the same carriage on the other side facing the boys, there was a policeman. He was reading his newspaper, but had folded the top down so he could look at them. "Do you jump around the soft furnishings at home, boy? Get your feet off of the upholstery and sit down properly," he commanded with father-like tone. His uniform was perfectly presented as he sat with his hat on his lap. He gazed out of the window, silent. And then the smoke began to clear and the train hit the open air, and there was London with what looked like some funny hot air balloons attached to ships and buildings. "Look, Henry," One of the docks must be having another bonfire. That's the third one this week," exclaimed Henry naively. He slumped back in his seat and stared at Henry. "These chairs, ugh, they smell like Grandad's shed." "Come on now, there's no need to cry. Everything's going to be all right," he sniffed, wiping some old tears off of his cheek. "Well, I know it is," thought Henry, "because I've got you. And, well, that's enough for me." Not much was said after that. The journey was filled with thoughts of what might be when they got in Winchester. The train ride went on hour after hour. There were large amounts of time where there was nothing out of the windows apart from fields, and then a flash as a station whizzed past in a blur. Edward and Henry woke from a short nap after another ear-screeching brakes. The carriage juddered for a while as the train began to slow. There was a crinkle of newspaper, as once again the policeman had folded over his paper. He looked and said to them, "Excuse me," but this time he said it with a warm and welcoming smile. "I couldn't help but notice. On your label it says Winchester. That's the next stop, my lad. You don't want to miss that." He chuckled. "Oh, thank you," squealed Edward, glad that the journey was coming to an end. He carefully picked up Henry and placed him under his arm, and then with a large strain he lifted up his heavy suitcase and wandered over to the door. Now, Edward knew that you should never talk to strangers, but Mrs. Green said that you can always trust a police officer. The policeman stood and brushed his tunic as he strode over to the door to join the boys. "These doors are far too heavy and dangerous for a small boy like you to operate. I'll give you a hand." "I'm not a young boy. I'm 11 3/4, snapped Edward with a respectful reply. The policeman's belly and rosy cheeks wobbled again as he chuckled once more. The train slowed and slowed and slowed some more until it came to a stop. The door swung open and Edward stepped down onto the platform. He thanked the police officer for his help. He scanned the platform looking for his parents and grandparents, but he couldn't see them from all the hustle and bustle. So he grabbed Henry and lifted him high above the crowds so he could have a look. "There they are! There they are!" thought Henry. "They're over there! They're over there!" But of course, Edward couldn't hear his best friend. Luckily, Grandma Green has great eyesight. "There they are!" she shouted with her very soft grandma-like voice. "Over here, boys!" shouted Grandad with all of his shining medals across the left of his chest. The only problem was that Edward wasn't tall enough to see over the crowd. So he listened, and he listened carefully. He found Grandma Green's voice, and he set off, weaving and pushing through the crowds as her voice got louder and louder, and finally, with a quick slip through two suitcases, there they both were, standing in front of their grandparents, with a beam, a smile from ear to ear. They were glad that they had reached them safe and sound. Grandad Green picked up the heavy suitcase as if it was filled with air. Grandma Green held Edward's hand, and then Edward held Henry's hand. As they walked out of the station and down the road, Edward turned his head and said, "You know, Henry, I think there's nothing to be worried about. I think we're going to be all right after all. And that was the story of Edward and Henry Take the Train. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you're now ready to snuggle down and get a good night's sleep. From myself, and of course Henry as well. Good night.